Sponsored by Surfshark VPN. This is a 2007 Jeep. So many modern day weapons. This is 75 years off. It just keeps getting worse. Whoever did the research for this game is a certified idiot.
Your name is Alex Mason. You were born in Fairbanks, Alaska. In 1961, you served in a CIA assassination team known as Operation 40.
Operation 40 was indeed a real CIA assassination group that participated in the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, it was made up of Cuban exiles and not Americans as shown in game. This cutscene anachronistically shows the 1968 population of the USSR and USA, but then shows the 1961 population for Cuba for whatever reason. Almost every time the game shows a map of the USSR in these cutscenes, it completely butchers it by firstly showing modern day political borders and secondly showing just Russia and Kazakhstan as the Soviet territories, while the other 14 states are incorrectly shown as independent. Although there was a very brief 46-day period where the entirety of the Soviet Union consisted of Russia and Kazakhstan, before it was then just Kazakhstan left as the entire Soviet Union for 4 final days. This of course only occurred at the end of the USSR's collapse in 1991. It then shows a photo of a Cuban exiled community rehearsing a mock invasion of Cuba taken in 1986, which is why from the footage we can see anachronistic equipment such as an AR-15, post-war M1 carbine and BDU uniforms. The song we hear playing in the bar is Quimbera by Ciela Cruz, which was not released until 1974, 13 years after the date of this mission. The Cuban Tropas soldiers throughout this mission are wearing a uniform which seems to be the Cuban grey lizard pattern camo that first emerged in the 1970s, and all of them are missing their headgear. They should be wearing a plain greenish uniform with field caps like the actual Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces did at that time. They are also armed with what seems to be the US civilian version G series of FAL, although the G series were essentially the same as the Cuban FAL rifles with some modifications. But regardless, they also inaccurately have L1A1 rear sights on them. We start this mission with an ASP pistol which should not enter production until the 1970s, with only 450 of them ever being made. It should be a proper 1911 or Browning high power instead. As well as the M16, which should not enter service until 1964, 3 years after the Bay of Pigs invasion. This particular M16 also has an attached M203 grenade launcher not introduced until 1969. In our opinion, this weapon should be replaced with an early version of AR-10 or 15 with an M79 grenade launcher as a secondary. And finally, this M16, along with many other weapons throughout this game, have either anachronistic, ACOG, red dot, or reflex sights, which were all not designed or implemented until the 1970s and 80s onwards, and so should not be seen on many of these weapons in the 1960s. For era-appropriate sight alternatives, it should be AN/PVZ2 Starlight Scope and Cold Scope in a few uncommon numbers among US Special Forces in the 1968 missions, or even the much older Nidar shotgun sight and Giza electric gun sight as optional choices as well. The insignia on the beret and arm of the National Revolutionary Police Force officers seem to be fictional, while their uniform and gear looks like they are based on the modern day Cuban police force. The real Cuban Revolutionary Police Force were a combination of khaki shirts together with olive drab pants and caps at this time. The Cuban police are for some reason driving brand new high-end limousine class 1959 Gaz-13 Chicas into an active combat zone, which also look way too dirty and used for a luxury car launched just a couple of years ago, not to mention that such a high-end vehicle would not be used in the Cuban police force. As we will go on to mention, the US's CIA tried relentlessly to hide their involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion by using Cuban exiles and Cuban-used aircraft and other equipment for the attack. However, this all ended up not working out as Castro learned of the invasion prior to it unfolding, allowing his forces to prepare and resulting in the attack failing miserably, with President JFK having to publicly embarrassingly admit their involvement in the operation, all due to failures in their internal security. Security that in today's volatile online world can be accessed with our sponsor Surfshark VPN. As you may have heard a lot recently, many of the older COD games, especially in the Black Ops series, have been infested with hackers who have been stealing players' IP addresses and other personal information. However, Surfshark VPN is here to keep you safe by encrypting all your information sent between your device and the internet. Its ability to disguise your IP location in another country can also allow you to gain access to location-restricted websites and apps, such as all of Netflix's shows only available to people in the US. So don't be like the CIA and don't fall victim to these online hackers. Get yourself protected, gain access to all geo-restricted content on an unlimited amount of devices by using promo code FROSTY1 or clicking the link in the description with Surfshark VPN after finishing this video. Now back to covering the inaccuracies, or as we like to call them, the black oops. The police officers, along with many other enemy forces throughout the campaign, are using Soviet KS-23 shotguns, which were not created until the 1970s. Also, it holds 7 rounds in game, where it can only hold a maximum of 4 shells in reality. And for some reason, it also ejects 2 shells at once every time the player pumps it after firing. Like in several first-person shooter video games, the KS-23 and every other shotgun in this game have a pitiful projectile range. The Mercedes-Benz W115 we drive here did not come into existence until 1968. Here Woods and Bowman, as well as many Cuban Tropaz soldiers, are seen wearing Soviet second pattern leaf jig chest rigs, which were not produced until 1988. The SA-VZ-61 Scorpion was first made in 1961. It was not produced en masse until 1963, and there is no evidence of it being used by Cuban forces at all during this time, although it is acceptable for the rest of the game's missions, which take place later in the 1960s. But as for this mission, it should be an SA-23 or 25 SMG instead. Also, when we reload, we can notice the weapon's bolt doesn't move. The hand grenades we and all the Cuban soldiers are using are M67 grenades, which did not enter service until 1968. A more appropriate choice for this level would be the MK2 grenade.
Better make it fast. B-26s are about to begin their bombing run.
The CIA did supply the pro-US Brigade 2506 air elements with B-26 bombers in an attempt to hide any US involvement in the invasion, as Castro's Air Force also used B-26s. However, when we get outside, we see that these quote-unquote B-26s that Bowman keeps mentioning throughout the level are actually just C-130s. Not to mention that the C-130 is an unmistakably American military transport aircraft, seen here being used as bombers. We can find the Cuban soldiers having suppressors on their FN FALs. Not only would this be very unlikely in the 1960s, but putting a suppressor on a battle rifle would not do much due to the size of the cartridge, meaning it should not be nearly as quiet as it is in game. This scene where we kill Fidel Castro actually caused large controversy in Cuba back when this game was released. The actual Fidel Castro and the Cuban government were furious seeing their leader getting assassinated in game, and in response released a post on their government website stating, "What the United States did not achieve in more than 50 years, it now tries to do virtually." This does become a little more understandable considering that the CIA did attempt to assassinate Castro over 368 times and still failed. However, we also fail in the game, as it is revealed to us at the end of the mission that we killed a body double. So, technically speaking, although the exact assassination attempt portrayed in game seems to be fictional, it does portray the desperation and failure of the CIA to assassinate Castro, which is actually historically accurate. Although the Soviets' ZPU-4s aren't anachronistic, they are somewhat misplaced, as the actual kind of AA gun that was much more widely used by the Cubans during this time was the VZ-53 anti-aircraft gun, and it was also used by the later seen North Vietnamese as well. Here we can find and use an RPK-74, which was not introduced until 1974. In game, it is also a hybrid weapon mixed between the RPK-74M, the Sega rifle series, and the Zastava M72. It also has hardware for an AK folding stock and has an anachronistic tech sight rear aperture sight. To fix this absolute mess of a weapon, it should be removed from this level and replaced with a proper early version of RPK for the Soviet factions only. We can also find the RPG-7, which had only just been produced in 1961 and was first used in combat by the Egyptians during the Arab-Israel War in 1967. For Cuban forces, it should be the M20 Super Bazooka instead. And if you're wondering why we are recommending American weapons for the Cuban forces, well, that is because Cuba in this year still had a large amount of US and other Western weapons supplied to them from previous regimes, especially M1 Garands, Thompson SMGs mixed with new ones such as the aforementioned SA SMGs, VZ-52/57s, and AK-47s. In-game, the RPG also lacks propellant charges like many of the other COD games, and our character fails to cock the hammer as well. Thankfully, the developers have fixed this problem in the newest Modern Warfare 2.
BTR!
Indeed, Woods, that is a BTR. A Castro's Cuban late 1960s BTR PT, which wasn't produced until 1966. It should be at least a Soviet T-34-85 instead. The first MiG-17 fighters did not arrive in Cuba until 1964. They should be Lockheed T-33s or propeller-driven Sea Furies in accordance with the actual fighters operational by the Cuban Air Force during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Plus, these Cuban/Soviet MiG-17s have Vietnamese Air Force insignia on them. What is assumedly supposed to be the US-backed exiled Cuban Brigade 2506 forces are wearing completely inaccurate and seemingly fictional uniforms and insignia. And if not Brigade 2506, then these soldiers, or Carlos's men as they are referred to in-game, could just be a fictional unit. But regardless, it's wrong, and the mission for some reason doesn't mention anything about the core role of Brigade 2506 or the battle over the beach at all. The M60s present throughout the game, including this one, are M60E cries, which were not produced until 1986. The gun also uses an airsoft matrix aluminium duckbill flash hider and anachronistic tri-battle sights, with the rear sights also being backwards. For this mission it should be an M1919A6 or A4 instead. Kravchenko's uniform that he wears through the entire game, as well as Reznov in the later Rebirth mission, have fictional shoulder boards. For some reason, the game uses modern-day prison footage when talking about the Vorkuta Gulag, instead of using any actual widespread historical photographs or videos. The Vorkuta Gulag was real, but it closed down in 1962, making it impossible for our characters to still be imprisoned in the facility in 1963. There should be much more variation for prisoner clothes, such as more winter variants like wool padded jackets and such, as seen in several historical photographs of Gulag prisoners, especially considering that this mission takes place during autumn in the north of the Arctic Circle. All of the hammer and sickle insignia on the peculiar looking Ushanka hats worn by these guards in seemingly fictional uniforms are backwards. As a matter of fact, we will come to notice that the Soviet uniforms in this game are portrayed so badly that my researcher friend Farizim drew out this whole illustration to show the correct Soviet uniforms and units. This Makarov pistol has an adjustable rear sight, which is only found on the civilian Baikal IJ-70 version, and our character also doesn't use the magazine release when reloading it. Upon investigation, we can see that the Soviet guards are firing at the prisoners with modern-day American M249 light machine guns, first produced in 1984. Judging from historical photos of the Vorkuta prison camp, there was never any massive bucket wheel excavator within the camp. Also, this excavator itself is modelled on the German 1978 Krupp Badger 288. These ridiculously large amounts of the aforementioned anachronistic KS-23s used by both the prisoners and guards should be at least the older weapons like the SKS rifle that was designated as an obsolete weapon by the Soviet armed forces in the 1950s but was nevertheless still used among second-line troops and internal services at this time. All of the AK-47s in-game are actually hybrid weapons based on AK-74 models which were not introduced until 1974. They should be actual AKs or AKMs instead. The first mass-produced sample of the Russian AK-47 was just simply called the AK. The gun was adopted in 1949 and not a single time referred to as the AK-49. In fact, around this time they dropped years from designations entirely until it returned for the AK-74. The name AK-47 probably came from journalists or reporters that got word of the 1947 prototypes. It is also noteworthy that other Russian weapons during this time like the Makarov PM, SVD and PK machine guns also did not have any years associated with them. Most importantly, the early AK variant that should appear in-game is the Type 3 variant, which is most widespread and popularly depicted in the media. Some of the AKs also feature a GP-30 grenade launcher. This, however, did not enter service until 1989. Also, it is incorrectly referred to as a GP25 in-game, and even if it was modelled on a GP25, it would still not match up as the GP25 grenade launcher was not adopted until 1978. Okay, literally everything about this is wrong. We are using an, as aforementioned, anachronistic KS-23 shotgun with a harpoon on it, which in reality would need a special OTS-06 muzzle attachment to do so, which was not produced until 1991. To shoot down a Mi-8 helicopter, which, although had its first flight in 1961, did not enter service until 1967. With the helicopter itself also being attached with B-8M rocket pods, which did not enter service until 1984. And yup, those are anachronistic double American M60s on a Soviet helicopter. The prison guards, or at least the reinforcements in the latter half of the mission, should be soldiers of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or NVD, based on the fact that they were the ones who dispersed an actual riot that occurred in the real Vorkuta gulag back in 1953. These Soviet soldiers are wearing what seems to be fictional body armor. It should be either SN-42 or 6B1 vests instead. Here we use an American M134 minigun, which is not only misplaced and anachronistic, but our character also somehow manages to accurately fire it from the hip, which would be impossible in real life due to its sheer weight and recoil. Also, its bullets seem extremely explosive for some reason, judging by the crazy amount of explosions caused by just a few of its bullets. Okay, where and how did Mason get access to an American 1887 T2 style sawed-off shotgun in a Russian gulag? And how does he manage to keep unlimitedly firing it while never loading it, and instead only choking it once every 2 rounds with this outlandish spincock? And yes, our character just completely blew up a Soviet truck by shooting it once with this old shotgun. But of course, this unrealistic, easily explosive nature of all the vehicles is present throughout this entire game. The GAZ-66 trucks we see and jump onto here are anachronistic, since they were only introduced in 1964. They should be GAZ-51s instead. Our characters, which include the literal US Secretary of Defense, are for some reason being driven around in what seems to be a longer limo version of the earlier seen Soviet 1959 GAZ-13 Chaikas. But hey, at least it's actually being used as a limo here instead of by the Cuban police force. Also, this Soviet limo filled with high-end US officials is, fittingly enough, being escorted by US policemen on Soviet Sniper M72 motorbikes with USA MP textures slapped onto them. This big mad Pentagon nerve center is fictional. The actual war room / emergency conference room in the Pentagon is shown on screen now. You may recognize it as the starting room of the Zombies Map 5. This imaginary M1911 we pull on JFK and the one we use later in Victor Charlie have an anachronistic 1980s frame on it. And when we do get to use it in Victor Charlie, we can see that our character also locks the slide back without reaching for it and then releases it instead of racking the slide directly.
Take out the Ascension Group. Scientists co-opted by the Russians after the war.
In 1946, more than 2,500 ex-German specialists and their families were transported from former Germany as war restorations to the Soviet Union in an operation known as Ozakoviakum. However, despite them all being German, these scientists, known as the Ascension Group in-game, are all incorrectly listed as having Russian surnames. Wood seems to be wearing an anachronistic mid-Vietnam War uniform, judging from the advisor-type camo on his TCU pants which first emerged in 1968. We start this mission with an MP5K, which was not created until 1976, although there is a similar weapon called the HK-54, which was later developed into the MP5, but even this was not produced until 1964, so is still anachronistic. The most appropriate choice would be the Carl Gustav M/45 that was used by US Special Forces and CIA units in the 1960s, which means it is also one of the most suitable weapons for the American Spec Ops to use throughout the entire game.
There's Soyuz 2. Scheduled to launch 10 minutes after Soyuz 1.
Soyuz 1 launched on the 23rd of April 1967, while Soyuz 2 launched on the 25th of October 1968, not on the same day as portrayed in game. Also, in reality, both rockets had a completely different story than what was portrayed in game. The Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 2 rockets were originally planned to launch together and perform a rendezvous and exchange crew members in space. However, after the launch of Soyuz 1 on the 23rd of April 1967, a storm at Baikonur Cosmodrome stopped Soyuz 2 from launching. Soyuz 1 then started to receive a series of technical issues leading to its crash landing into the ground, resulting in the death of its crewman Vladimir Komarov, who took the place in the rocket instead of Yuri Gagarin. This crash even further delayed Soyuz 2 and the eventual Soyuz 3 rockets from launching until October 25, 1968, when Soyuz 2 launched without any crew as a target vehicle for the radio search and attempted docking of the manned Soyuz 3. Not to mention that breaking into a Soviet cosmodrome, killing countless of soldiers and scientists before then blowing up one of their space rockets, which poses zero military threat to the United States, would cause an extreme, unnecessary international event and also be a major act of war. The Soviet MiG-21s have Polish Air Force insignia on them in Soviet Kazakhstan. Despite being shown as having Soviet military ranks, Kravchenko and Dragovich are always seen wearing these weird uniforms consisting of half-full military hardware mixed with leather jackets, which could perhaps be some sort of terrible civilian disguise or to show that they are going rogue. However, neither of these is the case for Kravchenko in Kazakhstan here, and for both of them in the Vorkuta flashbacks, as they are both seemingly still Soviet military officers in these 1963 levels operating within their own friendly territory, meaning that they should be wearing correct officers' uniforms instead. The uniforms of the Spetsnaz soldiers are completely anachronistic. Firstly, they are wearing the aforementioned 1988 second pattern liftjig chest rig with anachronistic SSH-68 helmets, M88 olive Afghankas which were not used until the mid-1980s, Crimson Berets, which existed among Soviet paratroopers, or VDV, in the mid to late 1960s, and seem to have been implanted into special force units in 1978, with the Berets in-game also having no insignia on them. And some are seen wearing KZS camp suits not produced until 1975. We figured that what they should have worn in this mission could be a VDV, Soviet Airborne Force, jumping suit and other proper uniform and equipment, such as an SSH-60 helmet, Pilotka cap, Talyanska, and RD-54 Airborne Assault Backpack. Historically speaking, Spetsnaz grew dressed like VDV during the invasion of Prague in 1968. In addition, the regular army soldiers of the strategic rocket forces that should be defending Baikonur Cosmodrome in this mission are nowhere to be found in game. Now, there is limited info on the unit and other personnel involved in operating the Cosmodrome during that time, but all the info and pictures we managed to gather shows us that there should be quite huge amounts of variation among them, such as a mix between rocket engineers and other related crew with black insignia, Air Force personnel including the cosmonauts with blue sky or blue color, and possibly motorized or armored troops with raspberry or red color. Also note that some of the personnel can be seen attached with red armbands as well. This modern day karambit knife would make more sense if it at least had a wooden handle instead. Plus, laser engraving on knives only became a thing in 1978. This UAZ 3151 vehicle, a slight modification of the UAZ 496, was introduced in 1985. It should be a Gaz-69 instead. Although the Soviets did have 7.62 by 39mm plastic/polymer magazines for the AK, commonly referred to as the Bakelite, although its material is technically not, it was developed around 1965 to 1968, which is anachronistic for this mission. Despite its existence, the ones that appear in game look different, likely to be inspired for the ones used by the RPK-74, judging from the 45 round version we find as an extended magazine in game. Thus we believe the proper version of this kind of magazine with 30 rounds of ammo could appear in certain numbers among Spetsnaz, at least in the 1968 missions.
Crossbow, explosive bolts, now!
Ah, yes. An explosive tipped crossbow, which also features anachronistic slotted accessory rails. The PM63 we use here was just introduced in 1963, and mass production of it did not start until later in the mid to late 1960s. It should be an SA-24 or SA-26, the Takharov ammunition counterpart of the SA SMGs we mentioned earlier in the Cuba mission. Since this level, the American NPCs frequently have M34 white phosphorus grenades, which are incorrectly shown painted green, which was not done in real life before the adoption of the NATO Stanig 2321 in 1987. A period accurate M34 grenade should be white. The SVD Dragunov in-game is using an anachronistic AK-74 based model. It also has a modern-day civilian POSG scope, which should be replaced by the PSO-1 scope that was assumed to be introduced together with the SVD on the 3rd of July 1963. These large and weird-looking metal ammo crates seem to be way too modern or fictional, especially considering that Russia, to this day, still ships their military equipment in wooden crates. The rocket launcher we use to shoot down the space rocket is a fictional launcher based on the 9K34 Strela 3, aka SA-14 Gremlin, which were not accepted into service until 1974.
Bastards. They don't deserve sympathy. We're here to hunt them down.
That is somewhat hypocritical of you to say, Woods, considering that the US did something very similar after World War II until 1959 during Operation Paperclip, where more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians were taken from former Germany to the US for government employment. Now perhaps Woods had no knowledge of this, but it is still for some reason not mentioned anywhere in game, despite it being more commonly known and seen as a sort of US version of the earlier mentioned Operation Ozakoviakum. American M7CS gas grenades in black casings and Russian letters thrown on them appear among Spetsnaz for some bizarre reason. The final two Spetsnaz soldiers we face in this mission wear a gas mask which is likely to be a weird combination between the MM1 and civilian-issued GP5 gas mask connected with a GP5 filter canister. For the proper military one, we'd suggest a proper MM1 or SHM41 connected with EO16 filter by a standard Soviet hose. The song Fortunate Son was not released until late 1969, a year after this level. The US gear being worn in-game is the M1967 MLCE version, which was not a common thing and you would never see a complete set during this time. The most common set was the M1956 LCE. The M16's 20-round mag somehow contains 30 rounds of ammunition in-game. The Shotgun Knight's Armament Master Key attachment makes no sense to appear in-game, as the Master Key project was not initiated until the 1980s. During the Vietnam War, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, which is often referred to as the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, used other kinds of Soviet tanks like the T-54, T-34 and PT-76 in reality, not T-55 tanks that we see in-game. Moreover, the North Vietnamese tanks prominently used during the very first stage of the battle for Khe Sanh, depicted here in the game, were PT-76 amphibious light tanks. All of the NVA soldiers are seen wearing only white shade uniforms. In reality, pre-1964 NVA forces wore khaki uniforms, but after that they changed to wearing green ones. However, the dye method for their tunics varied, causing variations of shade, leading to some NVA soldiers wearing pure white or yellow because of the constant washing of their clothes. However, this would not be for every NVA troop as shown in game, for during the mid-war period, the colors of the NVA uniforms should be khakis mixed with greens and some white and maybe other variations of colors as well. The NVA are also wearing fictional shoulder straps that seem to be based on Soviet ones. The earlier mentioned anachronistic M60E3 appears here again. Since this mission, it should be changed into the T161E3 model, which was actually used during the Vietnam War. The aforementioned anachronistic M203 should be removed or replaced by perhaps the XM148 as a brief testing weapon for US forces in a few small numbers. While the aforementioned AK hybrid among Vietnamese should be the proper AK variants like the AK Type 3, AKM, or even the Chinese Type 56 assault rifle. For the anachronistic RPK hybrids among the North Vietnamese forces, they should be the widely used RPD instead. And finally, the US M67 grenades return, being used by both sides. It should be the Type 67 or F1 grenades for the NVA, and M26A1 or M61 grenades for the US factions, as the M67 was still largely uncommon for them at this time. The stakeout variant of the Ithaca 37 shotgun seen here was not produced until 1981. The regular models for the Ithaca 37, or more common Stevens Model 77E, which is the shotgun of the Vietnam War despite its certain issues and often being overlooked by the mainstream media, should be included instead. We can see many US Corpsmen personnel wearing loads of medical Red Cross insignia, which would be very rare in reality as it would only make them stand out to the enemy and result in that. The model of M14 in-game is a combination between the regular M14 and M14E2 LMG, while the commonly used model for the M14, as in reality, is nowhere to be found. The China Lake seen among regular soldiers should be replaced by the much more common M79 instead, since only around 50 China Lakes were ever produced during the Vietnam War. Also, the China Lake in-game holds 4 grenades per tube, rather than the 3 in the tube magazine and 1 in the chamber as seen in the actual weapon. This under-barrel flamethrower attached to this AK straight up never existed. If the game wanted to feature a flamethrower for the enemies, then the LPO-50 flamethrower would be an accurate choice. The Python has a rather nonsensical default reload animation which shows the player character ejecting the entire contents of the cylinder using gravity and not the ejection rod no less, and then inserting as many rounds as it would be needed to replace the ones actually fired one at a time. The only way for this to work in reality would be if the ejector selectively ejected only the fired rounds, which it doesn't in reality. Also, the ammo is missing during its reload sequence. This Jeep, with the attached guided missile launcher on it, is modelled on a 2007 Jeep G8. Here we use a BGM 71 TOW, which did not enter service until 1970 and would not be used in Vietnam until 1972. It should be an M40 recoilless rifle, with or without a manual command to line of sights instead. Apart from these arrows, which I have absolutely no idea what they are trying to indicate with, this cutscene's map shows the Tet Offensive apparently occurring on every single part of Vietnam. Yes, even North Vietnam as well. This cutscene shows footage of the fall of Saigon, which did not occur until 1975.
NVA had surrounded the city. MACV had all but burned to the ground.
The MACV HQ was not fully captured by the North Vietnamese forces during the Battle of Hue in reality. There was never any massive limestone peaks or mountains around Hue City like we see here. Many of the soldiers are seen fast roping from helicopters as seen here. However, the fast rope technique was not first used until 1982 by British forces during the Falklands War.
Here, Fast 12, hold your incendiaries.
Okay, let's get this right. North Vietnamese army using Italian SPAS 12 shotguns which did not enter production until 1979, which we load Dragon Breath rounds into, which are not only not powerful enough to cycle the action in semi-automatic shotguns, but also would not even be introduced until the 1980s. And our character never presses the carrier latch button when we're loading it. The Fusion Robust 16 gauge French civilian shotgun would be a much better choice for a shotgun among Vietnamese, sourced from the French colonialists when they controlled Vietnam.
Bowman, what's he saying? Killed a civilian.
The NVA announcer on all the loudspeakers throughout this level is not even speaking Vietnamese. It is quite literally just random gibberish, which is not only incredibly stupid, but also means that Bowman, who for some reason apparently speaks Vietnamese, should not be able to understand and translate it. On top of this, we can also find signs in this level with terrible translations, such as this baby formula advertisement sign, which can be translated to lemongrass baby. Brilliant, Treyarch. Despite there being woman screams very prevalent among the civilians, there ain't no female character models to be seen anywhere, only a few variations of male civilians. In contrast with reality, several of Hue's citizens, including men, women and children, either suffered or were killed during the Battle of Hue, which was one of the longest and bloodiest battles in the Vietnam War. To add to this, despite us being able to discover civilian corpses and the defector within the MACV compound, we strangely enough see only 2 corpses of US troops as the defenders of the entire compound. At this point, the defenders should consist of hundreds of US Marines, from the Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion 1st Marine Regiment, Golf Company and Fox Company of the 2nd Battalion 5th Regiment, along with American and Australian advisors in there too. A large amount of FN files are being used by the NVA for no particular reason. In contrast, the L1A1 variant in Vietnam was mainly used by the ANZAC troops of the US's allied side. The gun should be replaced by the SKS and used together with the AK variants and RPD as the main weapons for the North Vietnamese throughout the game, while also mixed in with some other appropriate ones too. The National Liberation Front, or NLF, which is commonly known as the Viet Cong or VC, should appear together with the NVA forces in this level as well, based on the VC's 1st and 2nd Sapper Battalions, together with the NVA's 804th Battalion of the 4th Regiment that attacked the MACV compound, as well as possibly the NVA's 815th Battalion, as they were stationed nearby this area. This Hue City map looks slightly different from the actual maps in reality, notably the position of the Da Vinh Island south of the citadel. Here we find information about the fictional Rusalka ship. Now when I first saw its name, I assumed that it was simply just named after the original Rusalka ironclad monitor ship built in 1867, as naming ships on older ones is common in Russia. However, upon investigating the provided information, we see that the length, beam, draft and other such information is exactly the same as the original Rusalka, meaning that according to this game, this ship right here was built in 1867, is 62 meters long, is steam powered and armed with 19th century cannons. Not to mention that the Rusalka sank in 1893, making it so that this is 75 years off. The M35A2 truck made by AM General appears here. However, the original Vietnam War era M35 was made by REO. At this point, the McPhee compound should have been reinforced by some American tanks from the 3rd Tank Battalion since January 31st, particularly the M48A3 Patton and M67A2 flamethrower tanks, but none of their wreckages can be found anywhere in the McPhee area in-game. This Commando AR is an absolute mess. First of all, it unnecessarily is made to look like a modern M4A1 and features a 20-round magazine which somehow contains 30 rounds of ammo in-game. Has a fictional flap-topped receiver, which appears to consist of a chopped-off carry handle with bolted-on rail, something that was actually done in the 1980s by Olympic Arms and some other manufacturers before the introduction of actual flap-top receivers by Colt. However, this setup would still be anachronistic for the time period portrayed in-game, and a configuration not used by the US military. The extended mag attachment gives the weapon a curved 30-round magazine that somehow holds 45 rounds in-game. Like the M16, mounting optics will remove the front sight and gas block, which would prevent the gun from firing automatically. And finally, the weapon's iron sights, just like the M60's, are tri-battle sights, with the rear sights also being mounted backwards. For SOG forces in the entire game, it should be replaced by a proper XM177E2, while for the regular troops it could just be a regular M16.
There's a ride!
I'm not so sure.
Get the wounded first. More birds on their way. Sit tight.
The Huey can carry up to 12 soldiers, meaning there is more than enough room for everyone in our squad to hop in here, especially considering that we are carrying highly important intel. At the end of this mission, the opposite side of the Perfume River is visible, which should have some buildings and maybe a line of the Hue Citadel's wall in the background to match with the actual city.
The enemy's courage could be the result of their newfound ally.
If Reznov is referring to the Soviet Union, then this does not match up, as the USSR had been supplying the NVA with financial aid, military equipment and advisors since 1965. In this cutscene's map, the majority of Laos and the entirety of Vietnam seem to be marked as fully hostile territories, and the game never makes it clear if it's actually represented as territories or just influence or espionage manners. In reality, despite the ongoing Tet Offensive at this point, the communist forces were never able to capture the whole of South Vietnam. As for Laos, their territory map as shown in game is wrongly depicted for the year of 1968 to 1969. In this map, the entire Hong Kong island and some areas of the Khe Sanh district become a part of Kowloon's urban area for some reason. Even more, it looks like the Ching island in the map is smaller than in reality, and the appearance of the Stonecutters Island in reality looked much different back in the 1960s. The current day Hong Kong flag is seen here instead of the era-correct British Hong Kong one. The crow we see here at the start of Numbers and all of the ones later in Victor Charlie look quite similar to the carrion crow, although with a shorter beak. However, although carrion crows indeed existed in both Hong Kong and Vietnam, their presence is actually rare within both countries. The most common one in both countries would be the large-billed crow instead. Allow me to introduce to you the Great Wall of Anachronistic and Misplaced Weapons, featuring so many modern day weapons. First we have the CZ-75 pistols we started this mission with, which did not enter production until 1975. The automatic variant of the CZ-75 not introduced until 1992. For Hudson and US Spec Ops it should be the Smith & Wesson 39 or its Hush Puppy variant, while for the Spetsnaz it has to be the Stetkin APS. We also have the OTS-02 Kiparis, which was designed in 1976 and did not enter service until 1991. A more suitable choice would be the aforementioned SA-26 and or VZ-61. Sight Spectre M4, which was not developed until the 1980s. It should be the MPL that already exists in the other game modes. The aforementioned anachronistic Spaz-12 among undercover Spetsnaz this time, which should be replaced by the semi-automatic MTS-2112 shotgun for them. Same goes for the anachronistic KS-23 that often appears among them from Crash Site until the Rebirth Island missions. The PSG-1, which was assumed to be developed as a response to the Munich massacre in 1972, it should be replaced by at least a G3A3 with ZF scope instead. The Heckler & Koch G11K2, which in-game version was first made in 1989. It also features an inaccurate operating system and model components, like the anachronistic Troy battle sights, and incorrect reload as the player doesn't press the mag release on the gun. Not to mention that only about 1,000 units of this weapon were ever produced. And later on we will be lucky enough to find a second weapon collection containing a strange HK21E hybrid not developed until the 1980s. It should be an early version instead. Alongside a goddamn M202A1 Flash Grim Reaper quad rocket launcher, which was not designed until the late 1960s and started first being used in the Vietnam War from 1970 onwards. It should be at least the XM191 instead. What really gets me though is that there are a few suitable weapons already existent within the game, like the HS-10 and aforementioned MPL, which for some reason never made it into the campaign. For this mission, and some later ones too, we used the obviously anachronistic M84 stun grenade, not introduced until 1995. Even worse, in this mission, this anachronistic American stun grenade is used by the Spetsnaz, and we can see them again among Soviet crates in the later Payback mission as well. This Boeing 747 that is flying over Kowloon is anachronistic, since its first flight was in 1969. It should be either a Boeing 707 or 737 instead. This van is a 1992 Chevrolet Sherry van. This mission takes us back to 1945, where we will immediately see this icebreaker ship, which is the post-modernized Khe Sanh, whose in-game scene reconstruction was not completed until 1960. The ship should still look like its original 1916 version as it did during World War II in reality. As we can see from the colours that slip out of their scarves, these Red Army soldiers are wearing the outdated M41 Telogryka instead of the correct M43 version. The insignia on their colour tabs seem to be fictional. Just like in World at War, they are all wearing the star belt buckle, which was only worn by NCO or officers only. Or Red Army soldiers are somehow using half-tracks which seem to be American, Cold War era Tucker Snowcat tracked vehicles. The Ushanka hats for the officers seems to be correct, but the version for the regular soldiers, also seen earlier being worn by the Vorkuta guards, are incorrect, with the aforementioned backward Soviet insignia also reappearing. Reznov, Dmitry, and many of the other soldiers shouldn't have this much of a beard, since the only facial hair permitted in the Red Army at the time was mustaches for high-ranked officers only. They needed to be clean-shaven for hygiene reasons and so that their gas mask would enclose properly. Also, it might be noted that even the style and fashion of the 1940s was different, and men usually chose not to have beards back then. The Soviet 82 PM37 motors have an American M1 motor baseplate. The proportions are off with this PPSH-41, and the 35-round magazine variant is the only one that can be used in-game, not to mention why it only appears in this Arctic mission. The proper model of this gun should be applied and can also appear among North Vietnamese and Cuban factions as well for extra realism. Although there were a few German weather stations set up in the Arctic during World War II, there was never any massive bases like we see in the game. The German uniforms seen here are absolutely fictional. What they should have worn is a proper winter parka, maybe including the M43 Kharkiv parka as well as shown here. The German forces only have the MP40 and STG-44 in use in this mission, while the Kart 98K, the one that is supposed to be the most common among German forces, is nowhere to be found. Also, it would be great to see these captured German World War II era weapons appear again among Viet Cong forces in a few small numbers, as they were actually supplied with them by the USSR during the Vietnam War. The safety switch on the STG-44 is always on, so how he managed to still fire the weapon is perplexing. The scoped Mauser Nugant should be changed from the M38 carbine version into the more accurate M91/30 version with a correct curved bolt handle. Also, we somehow managed to reload this weapon with a full 5-round clip even though the scope is in the way. It should be loaded round by round like it was in World at War and of course in reality. It is also noteworthy that the scoped Mausen is using what seems to be a similar scope to the German number 4, but with either additional details or just being too modernized. The better option would be the German number 1 that were actually used by the Soviets during World War II. When reloading the Panzerschreck, our character never attaches the wires to the rockets that would be required for the electrical ignition. The smoke grenades we use to call in the motor attacks appear as glowing American M82 stun grenades. As of the date of this level, this would not enter servers for another 50 years. Even worse, when we actually pick up and start using these grenades, they will magically turn into American Willie Pete M34s, which were not introduced until the late 1950s. It should be replaced by the RDG-1, which can be used by the Vietnamese and Spetsnaz as well. These German SDKFZ-7s seem to have either fictional or anachronistic snow cutters on them. When firing the many MG emplacements in this game, they all have unlimited ammo, and some have an incorrect cooling system. For example, this MG42 would need to have its barrel changed after around 150 shots of rapid fire. It is also worth mentioning that the sounds of the World War II guns in this level are simply terrible, as they are literally just reused sounds from the 1960s weapons, as is the case with this STG-44 and this MG42. The RGD-33 with fragmentation jacket or sleeve installed is meant to be used for defensive manners, not for assault situations which would need you to take the sleeve off. Also, at this point, the grenade used by the Soviets should be either the more common Soviet F1 grenade or RG-42 instead. When we enter the ship, Reznov performs the Harry's technique with his Takara pistol. However, this weapon holding technique was first developed by an American firearm instructor named Michael Harries in the early 1970s for use with large body police flashlights. The British commandos that show up only have the Sten Mark II submachine guns, when they should be using Sten Mark Vs at this stage. In addition, soldiers using the Sten Mark II would usually not fully load their mags with 32 rounds, instead choosing to load the magazine with 30 or 28 rounds to prevent spring failure. And this loading method was also used for the MP40 as well, but both failed to appear in game. As absurd as the soldiers, the British commandos also wear a weird uniform that seems to be just a white version of their regular paratrooper jacket. They should have worn something like this, as worn by number 14 Arctic Commando that was disbanded in 1943. When the British commandos enter last stand mode, they use the Soviet TT-33, instead of a pistol that would make more sense like the aforementioned high power. Note that the TT-33 would be a good choice to rather appear in the hands of the North Vietnamese forces instead. This map does not include Laos as a hostile territory, while South Vietnam is still apparently completely under communist control. It also shows US forces being sent from Da Nang despite the city either being entirely captured or under the influence of the communists according to Treyarch's bizarrely fictional world. As we can see here, there's 80 goddamn bullets in this fella's AK, and even after shooting them all, we push him over before it is then revealed that the AK magically reloads itself with 30 more rounds, giving us a total of 110 bullets in this AK's 30 round magazine. The point of camouflage was to conceal yourself from the enemy, and you sure ain't gonna achieve that with this outlandish bright orange tiger camo on this M4A, the Commando. Besides this, there are so many other weird camos that appear in the game, even within the Vietnamese units. Here we pull out a WA-2000, which was not designed until the late 1970s, and with only 176 of them ever being produced in reality. It should be the XM21 instead. Despite being a trained and highly capable unit in reality, the SOG operatives all act like absolute ghouls and get killed so easily in game. In addition, almost every one of them is armed with only the Commando, despite the fact that they use various kinds of other weapons in reality, including captured ones like the AK and RPD. Apart from lacking uniform and headgear variations among the Viet Cong, there is also a prevalent lack of variety among weapons for the VC forces. They should have a mix of era-appropriate Cold War and World War II weapons supplied to them by the USSR and China, along with other weapons such as French ones that the Vietnamese already used or captured ever since the previous wars in their country. On this same point of lack of variation, it is also worth mentioning that at least 1.5 million women served in the North Vietnamese military during the war. war, and comprised as much as 70% of youth volunteers. However, they would have mostly served in the militia civilian defense force in the north of Vietnam, and so would be quite uncommon to see them fighting here in the south and in Laos, but a rare few still did, and so it would be good to see them in a few small numbers in game. The Python appears here again with another nonsensical reload, where we'll see that our character empties out the entire contents of the cylinder by using gravity and not the ejection rod again, and this time somehow loads 6 rounds into it all at once with one hand, since the other is holding a torch. Yet another wrong Indochina map presents itself here, showing the entirety of Laos incorrectly being captured by the communists in this year. The cutscene also only marks the Soviet Union, China, Cuba and Laos as hostile territories, but is missing the rest of the communist and allied nations, including North Vietnam as well.
Laos. Kravchenko. The fucking psycho was spraying nerve gas all over Vietnam.
Although the North Vietnamese did have their own chemical division during the war, the Soviet Union did not use any chemical weapons in Vietnam, as in fact it was the United States of America who were by far the main users of chemicals. During Operation Ranch Hand from 1962 until 1971, thousands of US aircraft dropped over 19 million US gallons of poisonous defoliants and herbicides over an estimated 5 million acres of forest and cropland in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, in which, according to Vietnamese documents, resulted in 24% of the area of Vietnam to become defoliated, 3 million Vietnamese people to gain health problems, 150,000 children to be born with severe birth defects, and up to 1 million people, including US veterans serving in Vietnam, to become disabled or gain severe health problems, all to this very day as a result to the exposure to these herbicides, especially the infamous Agent Orange. So yeah, it is really quite strange that the game mentions absolutely nothing about this. When we compare this patrol boat river to the actual PBRs used during the Vietnam War, we can see that it looks much different, as it is chopped with the entire middle section being missing in game. The song that plays in the boat, Sympathy for the Devil, was released several months after the date setting of this mission. The NVA's large patrol boat that shows up in the middle of this mission seems to be either very loosely based on an American Swift boat / patrol craft Fast Mark I, or is just fictional, with it for some reason having fishing reels, 2 American 50 cal MGs, and a North Vietnamese flag slapped onto it. The Dragunov was not used by the North Vietnamese until 1972. There should be soldiers of the Pathet Lao featured in this mission and later in the Payback mission as well, since the protagonists are fighting in Laos territories. It is also important to note that the Pathet Lao also received some interesting weapons earlier than the Vietnamese in reality, like the Dragunov in 1968, and quite large numbers of certain weapons like the Czech VZ-58 and AKM, although their main AK was also the aforementioned AK Type 3, due to the very strong relations between them and the Soviets during the Laotian Civil War, aka the Secret War in Laos. The Spetsnaz forces show up again in this mission wearing the aforementioned anachronistic uniform and gear. Since this mission they should now wear the KLMK with a splatter/splotch camo pattern with headgear variations and other proper gear, while the Sunshine Rays camo is optional since the camo and probably the suit itself were introduced in 1968, but might be more acceptable to refer to them as prototypes or test equipment. Plus, the aforementioned VDV uniforms might be useful for the 1968 missions as well. The enemy forces are now using the AKS-74U, which is not only misreferred to as the AK-74U, but was also not adopted into service until 1979. The AKM, AKMS, or even the Hungarian AMD-65 would be a much more appropriate choice for the Spetsnaz. The crashed quote-unquote Soviet cargo plane, as mentioned earlier in the cutscene,
The CIA downed the Soviet cargo plane carrying Nova 6. It went down in Laos. Our SOG team went in.
is actually just an American C-130 with a Soviet red star painted on the tail. It should be an Antonov AN-22 or any other such Soviet military transport aircraft. Moreover, if they wanted to use the plane as a sort of framing America plan, then they should have no red star on it. Besides, it would also be a huge risk for them, as they may be mistakenly shot down by North Vietnamese SAMs. Aw lads, look at what they're after doing to our nation. There's a big chunk taken out of Mayo. Donegal is pretty much completely lost, and with these proportions which show up in every world map shown in game, all of Dublin City would be wiped out too. What a sad day for the parish.
He went to Mount Yamantau. Fucking fucking Soviet doomsday bunker.
That's right. A fully operational military complex buried deep in the Ural Mountains.
There was never any massive military bases on Mount Yamantau during the Cold War, while the nuclear doomsday bunker that they talk about is suspected to exist there in reality, but construction and the first US sighting of this base did not start until after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. This looks to be a modern day hazmat or NBC suit. This picture in the bottom left is of Russian Interior Ministry Spetsnaz troops in Bezdian Airport in North Ostia during the First Chechen War, taken in December of 1994. I mean, like, what Treyarch developer looks at this high-resolution colored picture of modern soldiers and goes, yup, very suitable for the 1960s era. After investigation, we can see that these blurred texts also mention Alpha and Vipel groups, which were Spetsnaz units created in the 1970s and 1980s respectively. One of our research helpers, Alex D. Vasakov, notes that almost 50% of this game's assets are 15 to 20 years too early, which leads him and us to believe the theory that the game was originally developed for the 1980s or later periods, but was then suddenly changed into the 1960s halfway through the development. Because seriously, judging from these crazy amounts of anachronisms, it seems like the game really wanted to be in the 1980s. It looks like Treyarch had done a lot of development before some higher-ups said, hey, let's add the Vietnam War in there, thus forming this absolute mess. Soviet BM-21 self-propelled multiple rocket launcher vehicles complete with M21 field rocket systems can be seen parked in the US Beetle Air Force Base. We start this level with a Steyr AUG, an Australian bullpup assault rifle which was not even patented until 1974 and did not enter service until 1977. Somehow it is equipped by our protagonist and ludicrously appears among Spetsnaz units also. Once again, Spetsnaz forces with their anachronistic uniforms show up wearing winter gear this time. They should be wearing, say, a proper two-piece white snow camo as the Soviets did during World War II and still did in the Cold War period, or also proper greatcoats. Even worse, the Spetsnaz are using the famous Valeries, which wasn't developed until 1978, with the in-game Pacific version not coming into existence until the early 2000s. To replace these absurdly anachronistic and out-of-place bullpup firearms, few numbers of Soviet prototypes such as the TKB-011 and or TKB-022 PM mixed with other suitable weapons would be more appropriate. The aforementioned Western HK-21 also ridiculously appears among the Soviets as a main machine gun for them in this level as well. Some of the Spetsnaz troops have French F1 grenades attached to their bodies, but use the still rare American M67 hand grenades against us, instead of the accurate Soviet F1 or RGD-5 grenades. I mean, like, whoever did the research for this game is a certified idiot! You can just tell that they googled F1 grenade and modeled it on the first image they found, which just so happened to be the French World War I era one. Even worse, these winter troops are also equipped with American M34 white phosphorus grenades, together with the aforementioned American M7 CS gas grenades in black casings and Russian leathers. The build, sound and function of this sticky Semtex grenade does not match up with any actual Semtex explosive in reality. Sticky grenades were used during World War II, however the ones in game do not have a non-stick handle, and are just a sticky sphere, meaning that it would stick to your hand or any other material it comes in contact with, which would result in a not so fun time for the user. The height and steepness of Mount Yamantau in game is ridiculously over-exaggerated. Here is a picture of what the mountain actually looks like.
Dragovich is fully weaponized and deployed Nova 6.
That test subject or victim was the result of smallpox, not any fictional Nova 6 gas. Once again, we see what appears to be another modern-day hazmat or NBC suit. For a fourth time, the game messes up its Indochina map, this time incorrectly showing the entirety of Vietnam and Laos to be either completely captured or infiltrated by the communists at this point.
You see that hind? We're gonna take it.
Indeed, Woods, that is a hind, a male Mi-24A hind, which is crazy for you to identify considering that this helicopter did not even have its first flight until a year after this mission in 1969, let alone enter service, which was not until 1972. Since the Rottweil Olympia shotgun was not introduced until 1972, it should be replaced by the aforementioned Fusion Robust for the VC, while those in Spetsnaz controlled areas and used by the unit can be IZH-58s. The anachronistic Mi-24A helicopters also utilize UB-32 rocket pods to fire S-5 rockets. However, Woods incorrectly calls the pods
UB-32 rockets.
The MIL Mi-8 helicopters show up again with their anachronistic B-8M rocket pods, but this time they actually use the rockets on us, revealing that they shoot S-5 rockets instead of the appropriate S-8 rockets. The ZSU-23-4 Shilka tanks we see here were not deployed in the Vietnam War until 1975. How the Galil and IMI Uzi appear among Spetsnaz weapon crates, even being used by the Spetsnaz in this mission, is perplexing. It'd make more sense if there was any other appropriate Western or American captured weapons like the M16 or M60. Not to mention that the IMI Galil wasn't introduced until 1972. The FN version was the only kind of Uzi available in Vietnam among US Spec Ops, not the IMI lookalike version we see in-game. Also, the Uzi's magazine is slightly shorter than normal. The markings at the rear of the gun label it as IZI and the manufacturer as IWI. The latter is anachronistic as IWI was not established until 2005. Other Uzi markings include semi-auto and Model B, with the fire selector having AFS markings. These indicate that the weapon is in fact a civilian model converted to full auto. Additionally, it is lacking the underfolding stock. This cutscene shows the US Navy's SSBN-931 and SSBN-517 submarines, which both did not exist in real life. This level starts with us infiltrating into Vozrostinia or Rebirth Island, using a weird tomahawk that is seemingly inspired by the modern SOG Fasthawk, which was likely to be loosely based on the era-appropriate Vietnam tomahawk. Since the tomahawk was apparently used by a Soviet seaman in this mission for no particular reason, it should be replaced by at least a Trudvacha hatchet instead. The development of the 6G16 grenade launcher that appear on the AKS-74Us did not start until the 1970s. Moreover, this grenade launcher should be suppressed when fired. Also, the model is mirrored since the bolt should be on the right side. Both the 6G16 and so-called GP25 in the 1968 missions should be replaced by at least a prototype OKG40 Ishkra instead. Here it states that the CIA team is located in the south of the island, but in reality, the island's town of Kantubek, which acted as the administration center and housed the island's workforce, was located in the northeast of the island. Plus, it's also located not as close to the island lab complex as depicted in-game. As a matter of fact, the southern side of Rebirth Island was just empty areas that served as test sites for biological weapons in reality. In addition, these transmission towers or pylons without any electric wires attached to them don't look like the typical ones used in the Soviet Union. For example, they should at least look like these. This MK-19 grenade launcher on the BTR-60PT should be replaced by the AGS-17 automatic grenade launcher, or alternatively a CIA operative equipped with a China Lake or M79 sitting on the vehicle. Also, this fictional MG beside the MK-19 should be replaced by the KPV heavy machine gun. When compared with the real abandoned buildings on the actual island and some photographs taken during their prime, some buildings in the game look much different from their real life counterparts, especially those in the lab complex that look something straight out of a Soviet fantasy.
Number 6! Hazmat suits now!
The term hazmat suit is used for the civilian versions, while for the military ones it should be referred to as NBC suits instead. The CIA's NBC suit seems to be either fictional or at the very least look too modern. As for the gas mask, it should be the ABC M17 gas mask with a protective hood, along with a proper NBC suit or other kind of additional protective gear. This Enfield XL60 was not introduced until 1976. It should be at least the Enfield EM2 or any proper American weapon. The either anachronistic or fictional gas mask and NBC suits for the Spetsnaz forces that appear in this mission should be replaced by an OZK protective overall and SHM41 gas mask instead. What is a civilian's American 1960 Rambler 6 car doing in Soviet Uzbekistan? The aforementioned 9K34 Strela 3 or SA-14 Gremlin, which was not accepted into service until 1974, returns here again, this time without the fictional manual command to line of sight. In this mission it should be the earlier 9K32 Strela 2 or SA-7 Grail instead. The regular army soldiers of the military unit 25484 that were stationed on Rebirth Island and were a part of Arouse 7, the actual biological project conducted on the island, are nowhere to be found, as similar to the executive order mission they should appear together with the Spetsnaz units. In addition, these guys might use a black colour among shoulder boards and other insignia, since it's the colour of those who served in a chemical and biological protective unit, although the colour is also used by several other units in the Soviet military, such as artillery, engineers, etc., that might already exist on the island as well. Once again, we see modern day prison footage being used in this cutscene. The Huey icon below has the anachronistic 4-rotor design. The ship in the left picture is the USS Baton, which was not launched until 1996. The cutscene also shows the Defense Readiness Condition, or DEFCON level, that changes from 2 into 1 thanks to the Vorkuta crisis. Well, we know that this is just all made up for the plot, but it is worth mentioning that the DEFCON never surpassed beyond level 2 in reality, and we hope it remains that way. Please. It also shows the AGM-69 Stram and MGM-52 Lance missiles, which both did not enter service until 1972. Although early test versions of them did exist in the late 1960s, they would not yet be fit to use as part of a counter-offensive to the Soviet attack as shown in game. The Mach-11 here was not put into service until 1972. It is also incorrectly depicted as a closed bolt weapon. While its previous version, the Mach-10, had been developed since 1964, it had not been put into full production until 1970, so we'd say the Swedish K or FN Uzi or any other appropriate SMG would be a better choice instead. This anachronistic American Mach-11 and the anachronistic Israel-made Galil, as well as the fictional body armor, all show up again among the Spetsnaz for God knows what reason. It goes without saying that this underwater base is obviously fictional, but I mean, how and why would a base like this even be built here, and how did the US not know of its existence or construction until now? It was built off the shore of the US during the height of the Cold War, just years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, there are so many observations we made that make no sense, but weren't exactly historical inaccuracies, that we compiled a separate list and put it in the description of this video if you wish to check it out. The diving suits we see here look like modern day civilian used ones. With our further research, we believe that they should be diver suits GK3s instead. The yellow oxygen tanks we see in several places throughout this mission should be replaced by the accurate blue coloured ones instead, like this one from the KIP-5 Naval Oxygen Emergency Survival Kit. Here we see what seems to be a Batyushka or Artemis underwater vehicle straight out of a Soviet fantasy or just looking way too modern. Although the Soviets did have a Batyushka project in the 1960s, they were not released until around 1975. The build and hull numbers of each of these 5 battleships do not match up with any in reality. Nearly all of the Hueys in-game have army insignia on them, despite the game heavily featuring US Marines in the Vietnam missions and also Navy in this mission. If they come from the Guantanamo Bay naval base as shown with these battleships, then the VZ-10 Challenger aircraft squadron stationed on the base should have F-8 Crusaders instead of these F-4 Phantoms. There is 2 main theories that the game presents to us in relation to the JFK assassination. First is that it was solely the Soviets responsible, for those were the ones who reprogrammed Mason's head to do so, and this was hinted by Dragovich in the final level.
I can make you kill my own president! Right?
And there is even mention in Revelation's mission intel that it is possible that the Soviets even allowed Mason to escape back to the USA so that the codes could be activated in his head for the assassination plan. The game's other theory is that it was the CIA who assassinated the president, or at least had a role to play or allowed it to happen. The evidence for this can be seen from President Kennedy's CIA mail account on the Central Intelligence Agency data system, which we can access here, and reveals 2 agents sent emails to him warning President Kennedy to accept some sort of cooperation or offer, or he will face the consequences. And the last one was sent dated on November 21st, 1963, just 1 day before JFK's assassination. Now in reality, the JFK assassination is surrounded with mystery, as many doubt the official report, which stated that a single shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, shot 3 bullets, the second of which managed to hit and travel through both Kennedy and Governor John Connally, which still somehow remained fully intact afterwards. However, both of the in-game theories also match match up with 2 other main ones in reality. The known shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, did have many links to the Soviets, as he was a communist who tried to defect to the Soviet Union in 1959 and had even been at the Russian embassy in Mexico City a few weeks before the assassination. Even more intriguingly, however, is the game's hinting of a second theory of the CIA's involvement. In reality, at this time, JFK could have become somewhat of an unpopular figure in the eyes of these government agencies, due to them having fears that the president might not share the same agendas as the CIA. This fear that Kennedy might oppose or even disband them could have heightened after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, which saw Kennedy not support the CIA in their wish to heavily support the Brigade 2506 forces, and with the president overseeing personnel changes in the CIA as well. Other suspicious information regarding the government agencies include Kennedy's motorcade Pat, which featured many turns, and the decision of the Secret Service simply to not inspect the over 20,000 windows over the president's route, along with the fact that the FBI had been actively surveilling Oswald prior to the president's visit, and knew he was working in the Texas Book Depository, but did not reveal this to anyone in the Secret Service. The particular main theory is that a man with an umbrella working with Oswald as CIA operatives, who opened this umbrella and held it right next to JFK's vehicle when he got shot, had a role to play. Some believe that the umbrella was a signal to Oswald or to a second shooter, or that the umbrella itself was a gun that shot darts. Things become even more questionable when immediately following the chaos and gunfire, while most every other civilian quickly fled the scene, this umbrella man simply sat in the grass with another man seemingly unfazed. In 1976, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was set up and investigated further into the killing of JFK, after it was confirmed that the CIA had purposely withheld information from the original Warren Commission investigation in 1963 and 1964. Around this time, a new acoustic research technique was used to analyze the audio of the assassination, revealing 6 possible echo patterns similar to that of gunfire. There was even supposedly alternative footage of the assassination taken from a different angle, which some viewers of it described seeing puffs of smoke or even a second shooter on a grassy knoll in it. However, suspiciously enough, this footage was last seen by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, before it was then apparently lost and disappeared. All this led the House Select Committee on Assassinations, an official government committee this is, to conclude in 1978 that scientific acoustic evidence meant that there was a high probability that 2 gunmen fired at JFK, with them saying, quote, "The committee believes that based on the evidence available to it, that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. The committee is unable to identify the other gunmen or the extent of the conspiracy." Thousands of US government documents are still to this day yet to be released, so we will never truly know exactly how the 35th US President John F. Kennedy was murdered on that day now almost 60 years ago. But all this proves that there is a genuine possibility that a second gunman existed, possibly with characteristics such as having Soviet connections and or being a CIA operative, all characteristics that are also shared with Mason. So who knows, maybe everybody's favorite number-obsessed character really was behind this historically infamous assassination. After almost 2 years, we have come back to Call of Duty Black Ops 1 with a much more critical analysis this time, finding a total record of 260 historical inaccuracies. But hey, it's not all bad, as at least they didn't lie and promise to make the game historically authentic and then utterly fail in delivering that promise, just like they did with the extremely fictitious Call of Duty World War II, which we have listed all the inaccuracies in here, or alternatively click on this video where we cover the surprisingly inaccurate Call of Duty World at War. All key sources and other links are in the description. A massive thanks to our research team including Verizon, GI Combat and Panzerman of the Fall of Berlin series, Munancho Inc., Adrian Barry of the Rising Storm 2 GOM4 mod, Alex D. Vasakov, and a supportive community in my Discord group. Thank you for watching. This has been the Frosty One, out.